Amen. Okay, so greetings again. We will pick up where we left off. And if I may share the timeline that we've been looking at. Okay, so we were looking at the case of Harris versus McRae in 1980. And as we look at this history, it's a lot of information. But as we go through this information, we must keep in mind the main objective. Because we see that abortion is a critical political issue today. It's a political issue that is really attached to the subject of equality. And women's ability to live equality in society. And of course, we have, as in this movement, we have a background, a heritage, if I may say it that way, which has inclined us to view this subject a certain way. And of course, through the light of the Midnight Cry, we've been led to re-examine many of the positions and understandings that we've held. And on many subjects, upon re-examination, we're seeing that we were not correct. Or certain subjects are more complex and nuanced than we understood them before. And that we really fall into a dangerous position if we oversimplify subjects that are very complex. I say in the conversations I've had with people on this on such subjects, that in that oversimplification, there is suffering inflicted upon other people. Right? If someone finds themselves on the wrong side of an issue that you've boiled down to a basic right or wrong position, that's going to affect how you treat them. And of course, you know, the Midnight Cry has also opened up the importance of understanding the history of the subject and viewing it in context. And that's what we've been trying to do. So, and up until now, I think one point has been established quite clearly. We see that the subject of abortion, has become a proxy issue. That the radical right is used, that the religious right is using to advance their religious and political agenda. Okay. So we had left off with the subject of the court case of Harris versus McRae. And we saw that this was another success of the anti-choice movement. We spoke about how Cora McRae, a pregnant recipient of medical aid, she sued in court challenging the Hyde Amendment. And this case was granted class action status. Which meant that its ruling would set a precedent countrywide. And what we saw yesterday was that the Supreme Court upheld the Hyde Amendment. And we also spoke about how their reasoning in their judgment opens up a lot of problematic precedents. For one, the Supreme Court ruled that not having access to a right does not violate equal protection. So if you are poor and can't afford to access that right, it does not mean you've been denied that right. It was their reasoning. So being poor did not give you protected class status. And this has far-reaching implications. And another issue that was raised was the fact that the supporters of the Hyde Amendment consistently referenced religion in their motivations. But the Supreme Court then ruled that that was not a violation of the separation of church and state, essentially. So that is also problematic in its implications, because it it creates a situation where the separation of church and state is not as solid as it was once thought to be. Right. So we come to the architects of the religious right. Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell. As they saw how things played out with this case, to them, it confirmed to them their wisdom in centering abortion in their strategy. And what followed from this decision was that anti-choice organizations began to become really active in developing legislation to undermine Roe versus Wade. One being Americans United for Life. And I'll just make note of this one. So you have Americans United for Life, or AUL. Now, Americans United for Life was founded in 1971. And its purpose was to advocate against advances that they felt undermined a biblical worldview. They focused on abortion, embryonic stem cell research, contraception, and death with dignity efforts. And also against what it considered unnatural methods of childbearing, such as in vitro fertilization. So Americans United for Life worked parallel to ALEC. It worked parallel to ALEC. And ALEC, you'll remember, is the American Legislative Exchange Council. And where ALEC worked to produce right-wing corporate legislation, AUL worked on these other issues such as abortion. So following Cora versus McRae, the AUL moved very quickly to expand its victory. Sorry, I said Harris versus McRae, not Cora versus McRae. All right, so following Harris versus McRae, the AUL moved very quickly to expand their victory. and began to produce model legislation for conservative state governments. And this is something that we need to see, because it's something that has been brought out by the message recently, which is the subtlety that is involved in all that we are seeing today. For example, we know we're not going to see the Constitution repealed. The Constitution is going to remain in place as it is. But what we're seeing is the way it is interpreted is being manipulated. It's much more subtle than what we expected would happen in the previous dispensation. Ellen White says, we will see a reemergence of tyranny in the United States. But today we know that the organs of government, the organs of a Republican government, that those are not going to be removed, those are going to remain. But they're going to be so manipulated that the effect will be the putting in place of tyranny. It's much more subtle. And it's the same thing with this subject that we are studying. Because some may expect Roe versus Wade to be overturned entirely. Right? Something very, a stunning development, and efforts are being made to overturn Roe versus Wade. But, Roe versus Wade does not need to be overturned. While Roe versus Wade is a federal, while Roe versus Wade is upheld at the federal level, organizations such as the AUL have been working to pass legislation, to have legislation passed at the state level, where people are not paying as close attention to what's going on. They're working to have legislation passed at the state level that makes it harder to access abortion. So while Roe versus Wade remains in place at face value, in truth, it has been hollowed out. Right? It has been emptied out. an example of the success of these organizations is the fact that there's some states like Tennessee, states with millions of people, but so that may have only one abortion clinic. Now imagine an entire state with millions of people only having one clinic. Right? It's completely removing access to the right. Realistically. Right. So that's what we need to observe. It's these organizations, most of us, you're probably hearing them for the first time. But they've made a lot of progress in undermining gender equality. Okay, so we're looking at Harris versus McRae. Now we come to another case. It's not on this chart. I will add it and send an updated chart. But this case is a 1992 case. The 1992 case of Planned Parenthood. Right? Planned Parenthood is the largest provider of family planning services in the United States. In addition to, it's the largest provider of abortion as well. Okay, so when we look at Planned Parenthood versus Casey, this was a Supreme Court case that brought a challenge to 5 provisions of a Pennsylvania anti-abortion law. And this law had various provisions that were argued to be unconstitutional. These included a mandatory waiting period before a woman could receive an abortion. The requirement to inform her spouse if she wanted an abortion. Among others. So this case having reached the Supreme Court, it essentially became a reevaluation of Roe versus Wade in its entirety. So people watch this case very closely. Because they saw that the rights that were gained through Roe versus Wade were hanging in the balance. But the court upheld the constitutional right for a woman to have abortion. So that the fundamental right to have access to an abortion was preserved. But the details, of their judgment opened up many issues. I've done some reading on this case, and it's very technical. But to put it simply, while they upheld the right for a woman to have an abortion, they lowered the bar for the types of things anti-choice organizations could do. To make abortion harder to access. So while at face value, it looked like defeat to the anti-choice movement, the anti-choice movement saw a gold mine of opportunities. In the details of the judgment. And it's after this 1992 case that we see organizations like Americans United for Life and other organizations really going into overdrive to develop new laws for willing governments in the United States. Okay, so as we come to our chart, right? So that would be in 1992. It's not on this chart, but we will add it. What we want to do, though, is we've gone from Harris versus McRae in 1980. And to Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992. We want to go back and fill in some of that history from around 1980 onwards. And as we do that, we're going to look at the first major electoral success of the religious right and the anti-choice movement. And this was the election of Ronald Reagan. We'll talk about his campaign in 1976, 1980. Right, so the anti-feminist shift in the strategy of the religious right it was perfectly timed to take advantage of something. It was perfectly timed to take advantage of the anger and resentment of working class white men. So you have this demographic of working class white men from rural backgrounds, predominantly, and they felt that they were falling behind economically, and that the concerns of racial minorities and women were starting to overtake their own concerns. So Reagan framed a campaign strategy which made heavy appeals to racist attitudes, but which also integrated anti-feminist narratives. So Reagan worked to integrate anti-feminism into the core of his strategies. When defending his failed economic policies in 1982, 1982, um, he argued that part of the unemployment problem, um, part of the unemployment problem is not so much the recession that was happening. And he says, ladies, I'm not picking on you, but more of you entering the workforce is the reason why this is happening. Right? So this strategy uh, of racism on the one hand and anti-feminism on the other, it worked so well that social scientists gave a name to Reagan's key audience. They called them change resistors. Right? It described them as disproportionately unemployed, resentful, convinced that they were being left behind by a changing society, and most hostile to feminism. So I'll just speak briefly about how Reagan handled the subject of race. In his 1976 campaign, he used fake stories to stoke racial resentment. He spoke to crowds about people buying, living luxuriously, of, swimming pools and housing projects. Right? And he popularized the term welfare queen. Some of you may be familiar with that term. Right? To create to create this image of, that, black people were taking advantage of the system and white people were losing out. So his strategy, it heavily relied on disinformation, and it worked. He won popular support for the economic policies which were really harmful in the years of his presidency. Right? His policies slashed housing benefits. It cut aid to children in poverty. And it cut feeding programs for the poor. Okay, so something that the author of the book we're looking at makes note of is the role of conservative white women in this history. As the Republican Party increasingly turned away from support of gender equality and Roe versus Wade. The women who held on to jobs in the Republican Party they found themselves in a difficult position. They could either lose their position in the party if they continue to support equality, or they could protect what privilege they had by helping the party in their fight against equality. And many chose to preserve their social standing than to fight for genuine equality. Many of these women ended up as advisors, as campaign policy advisors. Working to redefine Republican feminism. And this betrayal, the book uses the word betrayal. This betrayal by white women of gender equality left a mark which we see to this very day. The 1980 election that Reagan won was the first time you really saw a partisan division between women in the United States. Today you have this pattern where the feminist movement before that time was quite a multicultural, was a multiracial movement. But what you see after Reagan wins is that you see a clear racial division after 1980. Where women of color overwhelmingly vote Democrat. Right. So there's that, there's the racial division in how women vote in the United States. And it has persisted from the 1980 election onwards. So from Reagan onwards, the religious right has retained a level of influence within the Republican Party such that anti-choice has become the orthodox position within the party. It has not only become the orthodox position of the Republican Party, it has become a litmus test. It has become a prerequisite, a requirement for support. And what that has created within the Republican Party is an arms race for who can be the most fervent basher of abortion. Now, the author of this book, Ilyse Hogue, she uses an illustration that some of us may be familiar with. I'll share this here. She compares and contrasts the careers of two conservative media personalities. Tomi Lahren and Ben Shapiro. Some of you may be familiar with them if you follow the news. When you look at Tomi Lahren, some of you may remember years ago, around about 2017, she was an extremely popular young commentator on the conservative platform called The Blaze. And then, she's widely popular for a period of time until one morning on the talk show The View, Lahren suggested that the Republican Party's focus on abortion was contrary to her commitment to small government. She believed the government should not interfere in people's lives. Right? And the anti-choice campaigning of the Republican Party was not in agreement with that. And you may remember, I certainly remember myself, the backlash that she suffered as a result of that statement. Almost overnight, she was excommunicated from the conservative right-wing media establishment. She lost her show on The Blaze. And has a much smaller role on a Fox News online program. She lost her sponsors. Now, you look at Ben Shapiro, on the other hand. You could say equally as popular. He has his own radio show and his own YouTube channel, which is very popular in right-wing circles. He, on the other hand, gave full support to the radical right anti-choice position. And, you know, if you compare what has happened with Larence since 2017 and Shapiro, his career has really soared. And he was the keynote speaker at the 2019 March for Life. Okay, so we've covered a lot of information. It's a lot to digest and unpack. But what we should see is this, you know, we should see the progress of the religious right. Their growth to power you know, through the use of this proxy of abortion. We should see how they've, you know, we should see how they've used misinformation and propaganda. How they've established organizations to advance their cause. How they've captured the Republican Party. How they've captured the right-wing media establishment. And now we come to another piece of this story. It's another organization that we're going to look at. And this is the Federalist Society. the Federalist Society. Just to put some contextual pieces for our look at the Federalist Society. The architects of the religious right, they understood that they now held enough power in the Republican Party to control the agenda. But they knew they needed more influence in Washington, D.C., at the seat of government. That's where organizations like the Heritage Foundation come in. Heritage Foundation. When you look at the Heritage Foundation, it was founded by Weyrich, and it developed a lot of the policy proposals that were used by Ronald Reagan. As a matter of fact, it controlled much of the policy agenda of the Reagan administration. And even when leaving office, Reagan acknowledged that the Heritage Foundation was a vital force, in Washington. So again, the architects of the religious right knew that they needed these organizations. Right, to be able to exercise influence beyond their numbers. And so now we come to the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society was one piece of their three-part strategy. To establish their vision of a dominionist national order. We'll look at these three. We'll look at the three parts of their strategy. The three parts of their long-term strategy. The first was, in summary, to take the Supreme Court. The second was to use state legislation to undermine Roe versus Wade, as we were discussing earlier. The third was to gain political influence through the use of disinformation. But when we come to the first part, that of taking the Supreme Court, they knew they could not rely on politics alone to implement their agenda. They knew they did not have public support on their side. And they understood the judiciary's power to, they understood the judiciary's power to force change. You know, they had the history of cases such as Brown versus Board of Education. And then Roe versus Wade itself. They saw that the Supreme Court could be an agent of forcing change. But the Supreme Court itself was insulated from public opinion. It was not influenced by the will of voters. And for a group that understood that they did not have voters on their side, they knew they needed a strategy to take the Supreme Court if they were going to win in the end. So in 1982, a group of conservative students and professors gathered at Yale University. They gathered for a weekend and they began the process of building a language and a culture around this idea of constitutional originalism. And what constitutional originalism is it's an approach to interpreting the Constitution which is narrowly based on what the framers, what they interpret the framers meant when they wrote it. And you remember the framers were all men. All white. Mostly Christian. Right? You remember the ideas that they had about Black people and women? So at face value, constitutional originalism sounds like a good idea. But when you look at its implications, it's very problematic. Certainly problematic for racial and gender equality. So they created this group and they called it the Federalist Society. Right, so they emerged from that weekend feeling energized. And began to make efforts to develop and promote conservative-minded lawyers. and to put conservative-minded lawyers in influential job positions. With an ultimate goal of installing far-right judges. And since then, the Federalist Society has really grown. Right? It's been heavily funded by right-wing money. And it has over 75 campus affiliates across the United States. So the Federalist Society addressed the first part of that three-part long-term strategy of the religious right. Reagan hired many Federalists, as they were called. And he nominated Federalist Society judges to the Supreme Court. There were two of them, William Rehnquist and Antonin Scalia. I'll just put those names on our list. William Rehnquist and Antonin Scalia. Okay, so we'll continue. Rehnquist, actually, I'll make the note that his nomination was challenged on account of his participation in voter suppression. In the 1960s, he was involved in Republican Party voter suppression efforts. But he was confirmed in the end. And if we may skip ahead to the present, if we come back to our chart here, you remember when Donald Trump was elected during his campaign, he made a pledge to only elect Federalist Society justices. Neil Gorsuch, who we put in place in 2017, the Federalist Society appointee. Brett Kavanaugh, who he put in place in 2018, another Federalist Society appointment. and Amy Coney Barrett, who is not on this chart. She's another Federalist Society appointment. And so what you have now is a supermajority of Federalist Society justices on the Supreme Court. Which you begin to see how dangerous that is when you understand, what views the Federalist Society promotes and encourages. What they found is that abortion proved to be an excellent litmus test for likely members of the radical right. And they found that young legal minds who opposed Roe versus Wade were also far more likely to adhere to the broader philosophy and policy preferences of their movement. Right, so that's an important point. They saw that those legal minds who they were trying to promote to the Supreme Court if they opposed Roe versus Wade, right? If they held to an anti-choice position, they were also much more likely to hold to the rest of the package. When it came to the policy platform of the radical right. And now you have a supermajority of these people on the Supreme Court. So, when we consider the setting of the stage for our Sunday law, the Supreme Court, that part of the U.S. government right, understanding that the government comprises of three bodies. The judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. The judiciary's already been taken. And the implications of that is going to unfold in the type of legislation that we will see, in the type of rulings that we're going to see coming out of that court. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. It's been very information heavy. But I think I'll pause here because the next section is a big piece that we need to talk about. So in our next study, we'll take it right up to the present day. To where we stand presently. And that's what we will do tomorrow. But, and then on Friday, we're going to take a completely different approach. Right, where we're going to be looking at the data. Okay, so yes, it's been good. I'll ask that we close with the word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the ground we've been able to cover. Lord, it's a lot of history and a lot of information. Help us individually to do the work of taking it in. Lord, that we may understand how to view and handle these issues today. Please bless us and keep us until tomorrow. For we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for time. I pray you've been blessed and enjoy your evening, afternoon, or morning. Depending on wherever you are in the world.